This is TWiT.
We've seen you a few times here on the TWiT TV network. You recently did an episode of Tech News Weekly talking about HEWLOGRAM, which for us children of the 80s and before, we will remember Automan. You were basically doing an homage to Automan as a proof of concept that today's technology could make things look like the 80s. It was actually amazing. Let's just start with that, because that was kind of fun. What got you into HEWLOGRAM?
It was Aaron, really. It was the director who works for Red Giant, and I was looking for visual effects because I had this. I was finding this very frustrating position of being apparently in the industry, talking to industry professionals, but seeing better stuff online, like seeing stuff in people's basements that looked better than the effects that I was seeing by so-called professionals, and I was like. I was sort of tearing my hair out and saying, like, guys, I wanted to look like this. And they're like, oh, that's just a tutorial from the web. I was like, yes, but it looks amazing. And one of the people who I kept coming back to, one of the companies I kept coming back to was Red Giant, because they had this, I didn't even know they were ads at first, but they were literally, to do an ad for their technologies, their software plug-in technology, they do these fantastic short films. They did one in particular called Old is New, which to me is one of the most brilliant short films ever made. And it has visual effects, but more importantly, these films have a heart to them. And I, as sort of as a joke in my conniving, weaselly, geeky way, I said, I tweeted, "Will act for software," and Aaron took me up on it. And he came up with this HEWLOGRAM thing. It was like a return to my youth. I started making these films with friends when I was like 13 or 14 years old, who have now gone on. Vincenzo Natali's gone on to make Cube and these other fantastic films, and television series as well. He's working on everything now. And it was like a return to that, but with people, who were sort of some people who were my age. And it was sort of an introduction to this wonderful sort of independent world in New York City, and it was just it was like this scene, like the scene you're looking at right now, where we're in the car. A cop came up to move us along, and then went, "Hey, you that guy from Stargate?" And so he's like, "Yeah, it's fine. What are you doing?" So it was like, it was a really like just a magical experience. Amazing bunch of people. Aaron, I was sort of joking. We went to this building in New York. And we're in this like rickety elevator going up to these studios, and with my kid and my wife beside me, and I suddenly turned to my wife. I said, I've never met this guy. He could be like, the doors could open. He could be standing there with like a bloody axe. And so my son immediately blanches. And then Aaron and I literally didn't even say hi. We just finished a conversation we'd started online, a couple of days ago. And yeah, he's fantastic. He's a good soul, and he's got a love for film that is just comes through in his work, in all aspects of his work, So yeah, it was an amazing experience.
I like that moment of you approaching the door thinking, well, we think we're doing something like a Star Trek, but it could end up being Game of Thrones. So I'm not really sure where we're
Who knows? Yeah. I mean, you sort of take for granted, I know so many people now. I mean, you, for example, I don't expect to see you with an axe, but I feel like I know you really well because we talk a fair amount. And yet we've never actually met. And that's such an amazing thing that we take for granted now in a way that this did not exist when we started playing with computers.
It didn't really exist more than 15 years ago. Actually, even really 10 years ago. So this is a new thing. It's interesting to me that you said you had this sort of hunger to do things better because you saw these productions on YouTube that had better production values than some of the things that we were doing for TV for huge budgets. And I find that hilarious because some of the people I've spoken to who are doing this, people like the Corridor Digital guys or Freddie Wong, they started doing what they're doing because they saw people like you on their favorite sci-fi shows, and they said, I wonder if I could do that. I bet I could do that. And that's how they develop their following. So it's sort of like the snake eating its own tail. It just feeds back into itself.
And we're seeing, I mean, it's funny. There was I think it was Coppola who said, the director said, not to me, just as a quote, that he was less scared of other film directors than he was of like a kid in the basement. That's where the next big hit is going to come from. And it was, it's happening in the film world, but it's not just the film world. It's happening in a much larger scale. It's happening in the makerspace with technology. It's happening with education. It's happening. There's just the revolution is no longer the realm of the big companies and the big money. There's so much stuff out there for people to be doing in all aspects of both filmmaking and the technologies around it. Another great example was we were supposed to shoot it was a dark matter episode, and they couldn't get the techno crane, which is that wasn't a techno crane. It was a computer controlled crane.
Right.
And they're like, oh, I really wanted to get it. We couldn't get it. It was too expensive. I was like, what? It's a robot controlled camera. Like what? Like give me like a few days and a few nerds, and we'll have one rigged up for you. But again, I think there's a real disconnect. It happens with the medical community as well. There's a real disconnect between what's available to people and the technologies that are available. And I'm just more and more seeing this chasm between the sort of the world of the establishment and these bright minds coming up right now, So I just basically want to befriend them because they're going to run things. So
it's very wise for you to see that across sectors. It's not just a movie thing. It's not just a medical thing. It's basically in all sectors. You've got a generation that has so many tools available for them to them, from software that can do editing effects that used to cost tens or hundreds of millions of dollars just a couple of decades ago, to people who are playing with 3D printers and CNC machines who they don't think about whether or not something exists that they can buy. They're wondering, well, how am I going to make it? I've got the parts. I'll put it together. It's a very different mindset.
It really is. And it's something I'm trying to get my head around still. I mean, I'm still struggling to figure out what the best way of approaching, all of these different sort of interests that I have. And it's something I see with the medical professions particularly, where there's been this kind of, obviously there's been this, there are the doctors and they know, they have the lingo, there's almost like almost a theater to the whole sort of medical profession, and it's hallowed halls, and people shouldn't be messing around with that stuff because it's a human body. And now all of a sudden, like one of the things I came up with for the kids, with my class was my lunch club, was that you can actually get these CRISPR kits to do like genetic modifications on yeast, and I was a little nervous to bring it to the class because I thought, oh my God, some people are going to really be freaked out by this. So we actually didn't end up doing that this year, but I will. I'm getting them in there at some point.
It's when I was doing genetic experiments in high school, it was basically worksheets saying, okay, well, this is recessive and this is dominant, and I'll draw lines from this to this. Now, you're right. I actually watched a science fair where someone was working on a new type of yeast that would work under certain conditions. And I was thinking, wait, you're a high school student?
Yeah.
You can do this? That's amazing to me. That is science fiction. That's more science fiction than most of the science fiction that I grew up with.
And I think there's no limits. I mean, imagine going into this stuff with no idea that there are rules and that there's sort of an established way of doing this stuff. And that's what I'm seeing. And I get so excited about it because that's how we got into film back in the day when I was making films as a kid. People didn't do that because you had to have film and you had to process film and there was sync sound. Everything was so complicated. The fact that Vincenzo and Andre were making these films at age 13 and 14 was a complete anomaly. And when I got into film as a quote unquote profession after that, I came in with this whole skill set that people just didn't have because they weren't doing this. Like, it's not like now with there's video cameras. Like now people ask me like, how do you become an actor? I'm like, dude, just grab a camera, make something. You got to do everything now. Look at YouTube. Those guys don't just write or direct or star. They have to do everything. And that's the way it is now. We've almost returned back to the day of Charlie Chaplin with that stuff. And the same thing applies, crazily enough, with with medicine, with electronics, computers, programming, video games. I mean, look at that industry. That's another one that's just booming out of people's basement, you know?